To Gospelspeak, as we see on the board this evening, we are at our milestone session of number 100, which would indicate we're going on 4 years of having done and doing Gospelspeak on a regular basis. We appreciate everyone that participates, and for those that join us for these sessions tonight, we have an interesting, in my mind, an interesting topic. The reference is from section 117 in the document. Is war necessary? And sometimes we can see that yes, we can answer that question, that we understand from what's going on in the world that often war is necessary. So what we wanted to do this evening, what we are planning to do this evening, I have several members of the family here. We'll start with my beautiful bride Nancy, and she will talk about a blessing she had several years, decades ago in 1982. When she would talk about a particular blessing that she had when we were at school at BYU, where the reference was to her future posterity and what would happen with her sons. And then we'll talk to Joshua. Joshua's joined us before. He will talk about, Joshua's an actual Marine combat veteran. He'll talk about some of the experiences that he had during his tours of duty in in Afghanistan and Iraq, and what happened there, and how his life was preserved. Sean then will come up and talk about the Battle of Samar Bay in the Philippines, World War II, and he will particularly talk about his grandfather, George Charlton, and what occurred at that time. And then I'll get up and say a few words, and the conclusion tonight then we actually have the very special opportunity to hear from my dad, my father, Fred Mazer Crandall, and both George Charlton and Fred Crandall were part of what we often refer to as the greatest generation. They were both in the Navy during World War II, so those are some of the stories. The point being is that yes, war is necessary, war is inevitable. And in the words, as we've talked before, of the great Civil War general Camp Sherman, where he said, war is hell, and it is. It's devastating. But as we talk this evening, we'll see that there can be, and often is, a human side to the conflict. And that's what we wanted to talk about, and where lives are preserved and where attitudes are changed. So we'd like to start here this evening. Let's see, Josh, if I just want to bring up the one slide here. I just want to reference this scripture, which is just our lead in to the discussion from section 117. There we go. Okay. That now in section 117, where the Lord says, have I not made the earth? Do I not hold the destinies of the armies of the nations of the earth? And as we've talked about some of our previous sessions, where we talked about the Civil War, about the Revolutionary War, and from my view, and I think we often can see the hand of God in these conflicts, and I often say he is in charge, and the result is what he deems it to be, and he also provides significant protection, particularly, I would say, for those that have faith in his divine mercy and grace. So if we go back to the camera, and we'll start off with my beautiful Nancy will come up here and talk to us to start.
Okay, apparently this is October 20th, May 5th, 1982.
Yeah.
Wrong date. Today's date. Anyway, Danny gave me what was a prophetic blessing, and it was, he has the right to do that as my husband, and he's very capable of doing this, and he gave me this prophetic blessing, and it was very long, and I'm not going to read all of that, but he was instructed that he should have me record it, so I did, and then we copied it down in my journal, and like I said, it was long, but this was just a few lines of it. It says, you will live to see a day when your sons will be marshaled for war and called upon to fight. Therefore, always remember and be mindful, it is a duty you share with your husband to constantly teach them the power of prayer and the power of faith, so that in that time of peril they may know, as the sons of human, they had been taught by their mothers, that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them and they would be preserved from death. And that was the blessing that my sons were given. And I didn't like what it said about my sons being marshaled for war. When I had that given to me, it was, my children were just small, and I didn't really like that part about my sons being marshaled for war. As my kids have grown up and gone on in life, many of them have seen many things, and my sons being also my grandsons, I'm praying that this blessing falls upon them too, because there is a lot of being marshaled for war going on, and I would particularly like to see that everybody come home safe.
Thank you. Okay, Joshua, I guess. You're up.
All right, so, Go ahead. Dog is here. So, I was in Afghanistan. I was deployed to Iraq and to Afghanistan with the Marine Corps Infantry. And being Marine Corps Infantry, obviously being the tip of the spear, you will find yourself in a lot of precarious and volatile situations. So I'll talk about those for a little bit here. I had a video from the experience I showed during a previous Gospelspeak when I was preserved by the Lord. I was taking sniper fire and I was unharmed, and I believe that was the hand of God and the prayers of my mother protecting me. But I do have a short clip from that same firefight we were in, and Sean can pull that up and share it now.
Bring that up. Okay, I'm gonna go on mute here.
Hey, hunker down in the compound. Hunker down in the compound. Toe shot. In the compound. Hunker down in the compound. Toe shot. Toe shot. Traffic. Two.
Okay, so what we saw there in that clip was that firefight I talked about before, where I was taking the sniper fire and I was in the compound. You hear the lieutenant on the radio. He's talking to the section leader who was in the compound with us, and he's saying, "Hey, take cover in the compound." He was talking to us because we were there, and he was about to fire the TOW missile, and he didn't want us to get hit by any shrapnel or anything. So he told us to take cover. And what had happened is that we were ambushed and we were surrounded by the enemy combatants. But being, we're mobile, we're heavy Marine Corps mobile infantry. So it didn't go well for them. Generally, you don't want to get into a direct engagement with Marine Corps infantry. That's just, it's not going to go well for you. And so they were losing that fight. And in response, they began to consolidate, out of fear. They all began to consolidate into that building. And that's when we hit the building with that missile. And then they scattered. And that's exactly what we wanted them to do. And they were all out in the open. And that moment there was effectively the end of that fight. And I can tell you that during that fight, we were effectively outnumbered and outgunned. And yes, we were very well trained. And this is exactly the scenario we trained for. But beyond that, we also had a great deal of protection. I know that for sure. I myself was personally protected during that fight. But also, we took 0 fatalities in the platoon. Throughout the entire deployment, actually. We all came home alive. And after that fight, I can tell you that they remembered us. They remembered our platoon in particular. I remember another instance where we were in our little combat outpost, and then we get some notification over the radio, because we're always on call, right? And we got notification over the radio that there was another platoon nearby that was in contact with the enemy. They had taken contact from the enemy. And so they call us up, telling us we're in contact, we need support. And so we all hop in our trucks and we roll out. And I remember we're approaching, the fight, and I can hear the firefight going on over the hill. I'm in the truck and we're rolling up. And then as soon as we roll up on top of the hill and our vehicles come into view, the enemy immediately breaks contact and they disappear. They're gone. The moment we came into view. And I know it's because they remembered us. And they remembered us from that fight. They remembered there was something different about our platoon. And I often remember in the scriptures when it talks about, at times the Lamanites, they refused to go to war with the Nephites because they remembered, because when the Nephites had, the protection of God with them, the Lamanites never had a good fight, and I feel like my platoon was in a way offered that same protection, and I know my mother was praying for me, but I also know that there are other men in my platoon who also had faithful mothers who were praying for them. And can you pull up the PowerPoint picture real quick, Sean? Okay. So what we have here is, this is my MRAP that I was in when I got hit by the IED. So in that vehicle there were 4 men. It was me, the gunner, the driver, and then the vehicle commander. And I remember when we hit that IED, afterwards, we all get out and we're, it's obviously a very, it's a dramatic experience. And so we're all getting out and we're talking about it. And I remember the gunner, he was up in the turret. And I remember in briefings before we deployed, they were telling us, the gunner is in a very vulnerable position up there. Large explosion. Did we lose?
We lost our OBS connection. Hold on. How do I?
What?
It says OBS disconnected.
It says
I guess it's. Okay.
no, we're still there.
We're having connection issues.
Guess someone doesn't want me to share my story.
Reconnection successful.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
You're back on again.
Okay, back
All right, we're back on. Okay, so as you can see, this was a very large explosion. This vehicle. So what happened is that we hit the explosive. The vehicle rolled forward a little bit, and then you can see the back tire went into that crater, and it actually fell over. So this picture here is after the recovery vehicle had uprighted the vehicle, and that tire there. That's in the picture as well. That tire got blown off. It went flying like 100 meters. Yeah, I mean, and these are heavy tires. They're not light. I mean, bringing that back, because I had to go recover that tire. I remember bringing that back. It was really heavy. It was me and I think a couple other guys. We went and got that tire back. But it was a very large explosion. I think the estimates from the engineers afterwards they're saying it's somewhere around 200 pounds. So it's absolutely a miracle that we all survived. And I mean, they are very well designed vehicles for sure. I mean, they're specifically designed to deflect blasts outwards, so that the crew is saved. But I remember afterwards I was talking to the gunner. And he was telling me, he's like, yeah, I remember we were in the turret, and then we hit the explosion, and the turret began to spin. And he's like, I remember I began to fly out, and then something caught me and pulled me back in. And he's like, I don't know, I think maybe my ammo pouch got caught in something, and I came back in. And I'm just like, no, man, that wasn't your ammo pouch. Mm-hmm. I know that for sure, because he talked about his mother a lot, and his mother was a very strong Christian woman. And she was very, very faithful. And I know she, just like my mother, was praying for his safety every day. And it definitely was not his ammo pouch that pulled him back into that turret. I mean, the ammo pouch is sewn on. Anything, I mean, at the speed he was traveling, I'm sure that anything that had got hung up in that turret would have just sheared off. And the ammo pouches are just sewn on with threads. They can't stop a full-grown man with full combat gear traveling full speed out of a turret. It's just not. It's not feasible. And I know he was protected. And I mean, and again, it's a miracle that we all came home alive. My whole platoon. And that was when I was in Afghanistan. When we were deployed to Iraq, I remember my entire company came home alive, and it was a big deal. I remember. This was the deployment to Iraq. I remember afterwards, the company first sergeant, he got us all out onto the parade deck, and he did a roll call of every single individual there. And I don't remember the exact number, but it's like 235. And he's like, we deployed with 235. We came home with 235. it was a big deal. We all came home alive. And I can just testify to the hand of God protecting not just me, but those around me. And I know, again, as I talked about, you know, my gunner in that vehicle, you know, he had a very faithful mother, and I'm sure that some of the other men on that deployment with me had mothers praying for them as well, and we were offered that protection, and I'm grateful for that. And so I can you know, I'm alive today because of that protection. I can testify that for those who are faithful, God will protect them even in war. And yeah, that's all I have to say about that. We have additional stories for.
Also, Robert would like to know what years you were deployed.
I was in the Marine Corps from 2005 to 2010. My first deployment, I believe, is in 2006. The one in Afghanistan, that was the one to Iraq. I think it was 2006. 2006, 2007. The one in Afghanistan was 2009. So that was my last deployment before I got out.
You also wanted to know if you were scared during those stories.
You don't really have much time to be scared.
You just have to react.
Yeah, you don't think about it. Yeah, you don't have time to be scared. So, all right, now I guess Sean is up.
Joshua, thank you very much.
Yep.
Very inspiring.
So, unlike Joshua, I've not served in the Marine Corps. I've never been deployed to a combat zone. And I'm grateful that I've never had to do that. But I do have brothers-in-law. My father is an Air Force veteran. And my two grandfathers, both, as Dad mentioned, both grandfathers served in World War II in the Navy. And the thing about the Navy is if you're on a ship, there's no such thing as a non-combat deployment. If you're in the Army, you may be a back depot guy, or you may serve in some supply or support function, whatever. If you're in the Navy, then if you're on a ship, you have a combat duty station. And both of my grandfathers saw combat. And today I'm going to talk about it's a fairly well-known battle to historians. It's called the Battle off Samar. And I read during the pandemic in 2020, when things were kind of slow, I found this book. It was called The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, and it looked interesting to me. So I read this book, and it was an amazing story. And I had shared on Facebook or something. I shared that I'd read this amazing book, and I was really impressed by it. And my uncle Bruce, Mom's brother, said, and I apologize. It's hard for me to talk about this story. He said, your grandfather was in that battle. And I did not know that, but I then gained more details. And so, Josh, if you can go to the PowerPoint deck. Okay. So we don't... Okay. So the Battle off Samar took place on October 25th, 1944. This was part of the counter invasion of the Philippine Islands when the United States was trying to retake those islands after General MacArthur had been ignominiously trounced out of those islands. We're not big fans of General MacArthur in this house, but anyway. So General MacArthur was going to go back and retake those islands, and so the U.S. 3rd and 7th fleets were supporting the U.S. landings on the Philippine Islands. And as part of this, you had the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and you had the larger Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which had happened the day before on October 24th, was actually, as far as I know, the largest ship-on-ship battle ever in the history of the world, and probably will stay that way for a long time because we don't do battleship engagements anymore. But it was a huge engagement. And the Japanese Center Fleet had borne down on the Leyte Gulf, and there had been a very large battle. The next day, and we don't have time to go into all the details, but the next day, the Japanese Center Fleet, which was still they took some damage, but it was still a massive, impressive, powerful fleet. They were opposing the landings, and they came up against this little task task force called Taffy 3, General Halsey had been decoyed away with his massive third fleet with like 3 aircraft carriers and all kinds of stuff, battleships and everything. He had been decoyed away to go chase after a wild goose. And so he left behind this little task force, Taffy 3, to oppose whatever may happen. The order of battle, just to give you an idea of what was going on here. Taffy 3, part of Task Force 77, Task Group 77.3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers. Now understand, an escort carrier is not a great capital ship like the USS Enterprise or something. These were little slapped together in 3 months, shipped out on the fast. They had a very small air wing. Maybe 3 of these had the air wing of a real aircraft carrier. And so there were 6 of these guys. So together they maybe had 2 real air wings. Their aircraft consisted of a total, between all 6, 165 aircraft. These were FM-2 Wildcats, which at this time was an old defunct fighter that didn't do much. The TBF Avenger was a little more modern. It was a torpedo bomber. So those were a little bit more capable. But these aircraft had actually been configured for ground attack because they were going to be supporting the ground invasion. And then the 6 escort carriers were escorted by 3 destroyers, Hull, Heermann, and Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts. And so if you've ever played Battleship, you have the aircraft carrier is the big one with 5 pieces, and the battleship has 4. And you get down to the little tiny destroyer that's got 2 little pegs in it, and then a destroyer escort is about half that size, so it would have 1 little peg. So destroyers and destroyer escorts were not large ships, and those faced this. The IJN Center Force commanded by Vice and 36 aircraft in a kamikaze configuration. This is not David and Goliath. This is David versus a whole fleet of Goliaths. Yamato is Goliath. Everything else is an entire fleet of Goliaths. To give you an idea, Yamato was the lead class in the Yamato class of battleships. Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were literally the largest battleships ever built. They were carting 3 triple 18.1 inch guns. So that's a total of 9 18.1 inch guns. Yamato by itself displaced as much as the entirety of Taffy 3. Yamato was a massive, massive ship. Top speed of 27 knots, which is impressive for something that large. You also had the cruisers, the heavy cruisers, which had 10 8-inch guns each, plus auxiliary armaments. They had a top speed of 35.5 knots. And then you had, again, all the Japanese light cruisers and 11 destroyers. Those were up against Fletcher-class destroyers like the USS Johnston, which had 5-inch guns. Now, for context, if Johnston or one of her compatriots scored a direct hit on the hull of one of these battleships, Yamato or any of even the smaller battleships, or even the heavy cruisers, it would literally just bounce off. They could damage the superstructure, but it was literally impossible for them to sink those battleships. They did have torpedoes, which if you got lucky might sink a cruise. They really had no capability to sink the battleships. They had a top speed of 38 knots, so they were a little bit faster. And then you had the Sammy B, the USS Samuel B. Roberts. This was an escort carrier. It had 2 5-inch guns, so even less than the destroyers, which had 5 5-inch guns. Top speed of about 25 knots. These were little ships. They were not big ships. And then you had escort carriers like USS Caledon Bay, which my grandfather served on. Their defensive armament was a single 5-inch gun in the aft. They each had a complement of about 27 aircraft, but you'll notice the top speed of 19 knots. If you're a math major, I'm just an engineer, so I'm not real great at math, but I can see that 19 is less than 35.5 or 27, right? So when this massive Japanese had no mercy, they would not take survivors usually, If you did get captured as a Japanese prisoner of war, you weren't necessarily the lucky ones. Things outrun the center fleet. But that wasn't their job. Their job was to protect the 6 escort carriers that they were escorting. And so Admiral Sprague ordered them to lay down the smoke screen, and they did. And then Commander Evans of the Johnston. This is hard for me to talk about this story because it's very personal to me. Commander Evans felt like he could do more. So, and this is ridiculous, he attacked the Japanese center fleet. He sailed in, launched all his torpedoes, and started firing his piddly little 5-inch gun at battleships. It was absurd. But Admiral Sprague could see that it was working, so he commanded the other destroyers and destroyer escorts to go do the same thing. They all went and attacked. There were many heroes this day. But the 6 escort carriers launched all of their aircraft with whatever armaments they happened to have, which was mostly 500-pound bombs because they were configured for ground support. And they just started attacking. Some of them weren't even armed. They would just do harassment runs. They would fire their guns. One aviator, actually, when he ran out of ammunition, he popped open his canopy, flew inverted, took out his .38 caliber service revolver, and took pot shots at the bridge of one of the cruisers. They attacked with anything they could have. And Johnston, Samuel B. Roberts, Hull, all of these small destroyers and destroyers escorts attacked the Japanese with such ferocity. In fact, Johnston got away. Some people call it plot armor. It was so ridiculous. He got away unscathed on his first run, and then he went back and he got damaged, and he went back and repaired his ship and attacked again a third time. They fought with such ferocity that Admiral Kurita thought that they were facing Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. He did not engage Yamato because he feared to put Yamato up against all those aircraft carriers that he thought were in Third Fleet that he thought he was facing. He thought that the little destroyers and destroyer escorts were cruisers because, from five or 10 miles away, you can't really see what's going on. But the way they were fighting like cruisers. They weren't You don't do this with destroyers. That's not what destroyers do. They don't attack cruisers and battleships. Johnson, Commander Evans, knew that he couldn't damage Yamato. He knew that if he scored on the hull of Yamato, that it would just bounce off. So he started firing at the superstructures. And he fought viciously and ridiculously. The Japanese center force retreated from Taffy 3, but not without cost. I lost the clicker. So the center force retreated from Taffy 3, but not without cost. In the meantime, they had been harassing the aircraft carriers. They had fired on them heavily. They had fired on the little destroyers that were engaging them like battleships. 2 escort carriers were sunk. 2 destroyers were sunk. 1 destroyer escort was sunk, the Samuel B. Roberts. Among the destroyers sunk was USS Johnston. Commander Evans was last seen on the deck of his ship. The steering controls, everything was damaged, everything was broken. They couldn't get a firing solution, so he was missing a hand. He was standing on the deck of the ship shouting fire control coordinates into the hull to tell them where to shoot their guns. That was the last he was seen. (1,161 American servicemen were killed, 913 wounded. But the Japanese, they sunk 3 heavy cruisers, mostly from those TBM Avengers. They lost 11 aircraft, 2 battleships were damaged, including Yamato from the superstructure. 3 heavy cruisers damaged, some of them severely. 1 destroyer damaged, 2,700 killed and wounded. This was a terrible battle. But on the theme of about the war from Grandpa Charlton, he wouldn't talk about it. He was deeply traumatized. The only story I've ever heard from him is that he was on his ship doing his duty. He was a torpedoman's mate, 2nd class. He had a battle station on Caledon Bay, and I heard that he was on the deck doing his duty, and his bunkmate, his buddy, standing right next to him, got his head blown off. Right next to him. By all rights, everybody in Taffy 3 should have died. The entire task, the Yamato by itself could have picked off the entire task force. Everybody on those 6 carriers, on those destroyers and destroyer escorts, they all should have died. Commander Evans saved my grandfather's life at the cost of his own. Now, after I read this book and learned what Commander Evans had done, and I say Commander Evans, but there were, Samuel B. Roberts was also sunk, other destroyers. There were many heroes that day, many lives lost, but I felt a specific debt of gratitude to Commander Evans, who had kind of come up with the ridiculous idea to charge these battleships. And so I looked up Commander Evans. I found him on Family Search, and it turns out I'm distantly related to him, and that was close enough that I was able to do some temple work for him because I felt I owed it. What's that? Oh. I felt that I owed him a debt of personal gratitude. He had saved my grandfather's life. I am alive because of Commander Ernest T. Evans. And so he had actually had his proxy baptism and confirmation done, but he had not had the initiatory endowment. So I took his name to the temple after the temples reopened after the pandemic, and I did work for him. His wife had also already gotten her work done up to the endowment. And so after that, I was also able to take them to the temple, and they were sealed together. Now, I would like to emphasize for those who are not members of our church, not of our faith, that when we do proxy work for the dead, does this mean I'm forcing Commander Evans to join the church, or I'm forcing him? No. The proxy ordinance is an offer, a tender of the ordinance. But I had a very good feeling that Commander Evans appreciated what I had done for him in the temple, and I like to think that probably he and Grandpa are friends now, because the people who live on the other side of the veil are absolutely alive and there and very real, and that's about all I can do. So we're gonna hand this back over to Dad, and we're gonna hear from Grandpa Crandall too.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much for that.
What?
Robert has a question.
That is a big ship.
No, he has
What's my Robert? My favorite. I have 2 ships that are sacred to me: USS Spikefish, a submarine, actually a boat, not a ship. USS Spikefish that Grandpa Crandall served on, and USS Caledon Bay that Grandpa Charlton served on. Those are my 2 favorite seagoing vessels.
All right, thank you. Appreciate Nancy, Joshua, and Sean so far. So Joshua, if you can bring up the video with Fred Mazer Crandall. So my dad, Fred Crandall, served on the USS Spikefish, as Sean just mentioned. And he joined the Navy when he was 17 years old, right towards the last year and a half, 2 years of World War II. And he was underage because it was expected they needed to be 18 to sign on their own. However, he went to his dad, my grandfather, Myron Mazer Crandall, and asked for permission. And according to my dad, and I don't know how true this is, but he said, I went and asked my dad to sign the paper for me to go in the Navy. And he said, I believed at that time that was probably the happiest day of my dad's life. Mm-hmm. So someone else would now take care of this 17-year-old young man. My dad was a very dynamic person, and after many years after World War II, when he was in his I guess probably late 60s, he would have been, or 70s at the time. There was a TV station down in Las Vegas, Nevada, that was doing a series on the greatest generation, World War II veterans. So what I have now is a clip of some events that occurred right at the last few days of the war. This is like August the 14th and August the 15th, August 14th, the last day, August 15th, the day of surrender, where the spikefish has the distinction, I don't know that it's an honor, but the distinction of sinking the last Japanese man of war during World War II. So he relates a story that occurred after they sunk this big Japanese I-class submarine, and what happened with some of the sailors, the Japanese sailors, one in particular that was on that
Was
ship.
on patrol in the yellow.
So Sean, or Joshua, if we can go to the video, and I'm going to turn off the mic here.
Was on patrol in the Yellow Sea.
So go ahead and tell that story, sir.
Yeah. In the Yellow Sea of Japan, and that was tough because to get into that area you had to go through a minefield. And I guess the most exciting time for me was trying to get through that minefield. And the sonar guy was trying to say, here's a blip, they'd spot it and he'd report it at 310, 250 on it. And
I just might say that the audio's a little bit low on this, so you may want to turn up your device to be able to listen to what he's saying.
From the mine, So we just went on through there, and I'll never forget this one. Hearing that mine coming down the side of that submarine, just along that hull, and I guess they were old mines because it didn't ever extend to open it like an egg. But we got through that okay. And so they're in the Yellow Sea and making that patrol. It's kind of quiet, and one night, this was on 14th of August, and all of a sudden I was a lookout as a gunner's mate. By then I was a gunner's mate, and my station on the ship was in the shears, with the binoculars, scanning the sky, looking for whatever. Heard the radar guy said, contact at 315. So, they were scanning all the time. We had the latest radar. So he got a blip out there, and boy, that got everybody's attention because it had been pretty quiet, no action. I'm sure the captain wanted some action because prior to that, the day before, we had just sunk a little old, found out later, a Korean little merchant ship. And we tried to sink that with the 40 millimeter, which they said, okay, Crandall and Scully, go up there and blow it away with the 40, but that wasn't powerful enough. So he said, well, man, that 5-inch 25, and that's a powerful gun, man. But that's a funny feeling. I was the pointer on there, which fired the cannon. And Scully was the trainer, which moved it this way, and the pointer did this, and he's the one that fired it. So I can still visualize after 62 years or something, those guys running around on that deck and that 5-inch 25 just pulling those, and we picked 3 of those up out of the water. We found out later they were Koreans, they were not Japanese, just little old fishermen. But I guess the captain wanted another star, but it was, what could that have ever done to the one? I felt kind of bad about it. And they almost died because they couldn't eat the American chow, steak and eggs and French fries. Boy, that chow on those submarines was really great. They wanted fish heads and rice. Well, we had the rice, but no fish heads. But they survived that thing okay. So on the next day now, you're reading up to that story of, we passed that, we got that blip on the radar. And if I recall, and that it's a long time, and if I recall, I was in the port shears watching, and when that contact came, boy, everybody goes over there, but you couldn't see anything. So he passed us in the night. It was about a little after midnight. And we went on down, and all of a sudden, we was going this way and that way, and the captain started swinging around to see if he could make a surface run. But then he realized he did not want to blow something away. It could have been a British submarine, or it could have been something else that, they didn't want to do that, so they wanted to make a positive identification. But as we swung around, the blip disappeared. Then he realized, hey, that's a submarine. And he'd kind of suspected that because of the size of the blip and that type of thing. So the blip disappeared. So he swung on around, and he's going on a southwesterly course, apparently to Formosa. And that's where they found out later on as they looked at the records, that's where that submarine was headed for. So he swung on around and waited for that, because he realized that sub would have to come up, because on those old fleet types, you had to charge the batteries. You'd only stay down 48 hours, and you had to get on the surface at night and recharge those batteries. So he popped up. Well, there we were out there about 10 miles ahead of him with our radar just leaned right in on him. So all night long, when we tracked that, we called it the other submarine. We didn't, have a name for it at that time. So we tracked that other submarine all night and radioed Guam to see if there were any British or other American submarines in the area. They said, no, you're the only guys out there in that particular war patrol area. So, but they said, you better make sure of identifications. So, I wanted to be sure they weren't blowing something away at that time of the war. I'm sure they figured it was about over. So by the time the night was over, the plotting crew had tracked his zigzag plan, his speed, every move he was making. And when just before dawn, we dove. So he coming along at about 10 or 15 knots, just following his zigzag plan. And battle stations, torpedo, man your battle station, general quarters. Boy, that makes your hair stand on the back of your neck. And my battle stations there was the bow planes, and Schoolie, my buddy, was the stern plane. So we got right on those battle stations, and that's where that keeps the boat, the bow planes keeps it level when the captain's looking through the binoculars. So it's pretty crucial that you don't dunk him when he's getting ready to fire. And so we were good at that age. You had the feel for tracing the bubble. So we held her at 62 feet. Battle stations, and he was getting the readings, bearings, so and bearings. And he said, load all the 6 torpedoes forward. Six of those fish of that submarine. So they had them all ready to fire. And so here he comes, chugging along, zip. They knew every move that ship was making. And, when the daylight realized it, the captain looked through the binoculars to verify big Jap I submarine number 373. We didn't know that then. And then the exec looked at it to be sure. He says, that's right, because they learned to look at those silhouettes. So he coming on, he says, stand by, ready, fire. Fire 1, fire 2, and so on, till all 6 fish, and they had them sped at 200 degrees. And when they made that terse command, you knew that young men would die, and somewhere in time, pretty girls would cry. And that was a funny feeling. But boy, we were happy. All of a sudden, listen to that thing, and then, pow! Boy, that rocked, 15, I'm not sure of the yardage, but I'll just say 1,500 yards, and that's close, because he was in there tight. And they said, we sunk that Jap, we got him. The crew was cheering and everything. 2 of the hit him, 2 in the middle, 2 missed him up front. The 2 in the middle hit him in the amidships, and the other one hit him in the stern, and he just blew him up. And then the other 2 went south. So we stayed down about an hour, and they kept looking around to see if any patrol planes were coming. There were 4 of them. There were 4 of them in the water, in the debris and this type of thing. So after he looked and looked around, he says, okay, prepare to surface. Klaxon went off 3 times. Ooga, 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 up we came. Lookouts to the bridge, open the hatch, lookouts to the bridge, in that order. So there they were in the water. But they kept swimming away. I'm sure they'd been told that if the Americans captured you, they'd torture you and all of this kind of thing. So they kept swimming away. But we caught this one back on the fantail. I've got some photos there where they captured this guy. They kept getting a grappling hook out there, and they said, nip on, no good, nip on. They didn't want anything to do with that guy. But he was, we could still feel the hate for that guy. We'd have thrown him back in that big lake if we could have. But what really bugged me anyway, they took him back to the shower. Now on a submarine, you could only take a shower every 11 days. The chief of the boat would keep track of it because you had to make your own fresh water out there to see. So can you imagine 80 or 82 men on that thing out there in the sweaty Asiatic Pacific? You get what you'd call the Chinese crud, big old blizzard. You see guys walking down there like that, It was horrible. And so here this Jap, and that's what we call him in those days. That's not politically correct anymore, but this Japanese sailor got to take a freshwater shower. But he was really built. I'd judge he used to be about 22 or 23 years old, just as muscular as he could be. But he didn't have a scratch on him. Can you imagine being blown out with those torpedoes blowing your ship in the air and not even have a mark on? not even have a mark on him. So my responsibility as the gunner's mate and schoolies was to guard this guy, because they didn't want a submarine guy out running around on that submarine, because the hate was still there. I mean, hey, you know, boy, if he could pull the valves at the right time or do whatever, he could cause some damage. So we'd keep him handcuffed in the forward torpedo room. Less than 24 hours, it came over the speaker that Japan had surrendered unconditionally. Man, talk about cheering and happy, because, hey, guys, we can go home. We're going to Pearl and back to stateside. Maybe we can once again hold a pretty girl and give her a kiss and hug her, you know. That was important to teenagers, real important. And there were, I don't even remember if there were any married men on that boat at that time, but the captain and the officers were, you know, those guys, they were men. But there was, and I called him Chung Hogi. That's the name of my story, Chung Hogi. Now that's not Japanese, that's probably Chinese, and I don't know why I came up with that, but we didn't know his name. Semi Satato, we found out later, was his name. I have that down there, we found out later. And he was a seaman in the Imperial Submarine Navy. So I had to take him to the head for his body functions. I had to bring him his chow, take him a chow, and keep him handcuffed all the time. And then Schoolie would relieve me guarding him this time. So on the way back to Saipan, when the war had ended, and he never said a word. Just boy, just you know, you could just feel that hate. And when we said, did I mention about the kaput, Japan kaput? It was come over in English that Japan had surrendered unconditionally. And I says, Chung Hogi, Japan kaputski, gone. No. You wouldn't believe it. Then when it came in Japanese, his features changed, and he just, this guy knew that his country, it dawned on him, finally, his country had surrendered. His dreams and his life and his hope. And I thought, well, and you could see there may have been some mist of tears in those guys in that forward torpedo room, because they looked at this guy and all of a sudden he was a human being. He was a sailor in his country, Kaputski. And I turned away because I thought, you know, how would I feel to be aboard a submarine and my country was surrendered? So we went on to Saipan. And I don't know how many days out, it's probably about 10 days from our patrol area to Saipan. All of a sudden he said, Gunther, looky, me got. And he's looking at a magazine. And I went over there and looked over his shoulder, and here was a beautiful woman with a little babe. Me got, Gunter, me got. All the hate, all the anger left me. So I turned away. He was a human being, and all of a sudden he had hope. I'd never heard him say anything. Gunter, me got. And that was exciting. So we docked at Saipan to let him off and take on supplies and go to Pearl and then stateside. And all the time he was there, well-disciplined guy, handsome fellow. But he
Are we back on? Okay. Well, I just wanted to, in closing, thank everyone who participated this evening, and just a couple of closing comments. As we stated before, certainly war is inevitable, but we can see from the stories we had this evening, and I appreciate everyone participating, Nancy and Joshua and Sean and my dad, with those stories about their real life experiences in combat. Then we can see, as stated to the prophet Joseph Smith, as we recall from our previous session, this revelation, section 117, was given at a very, very difficult time of the church. when they were under great duress from inside as well as outside. A lot of apostasy, a lot of battles, a lot of conflict that was going on. And I think the Lord was trying to help them understand that He is in charge. And as we see, as Sean talked about Samar Bay, obviously we can see the hand of God. And we've had previous Gospelspeak sessions. In particular, we think about the one when we talked about Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee, brilliant strategic general, brilliant tactical general. But the things that were done at Gettysburg, which I believe historians all recognize, was in essence the turning point of the Civil War. When we see the mistakes that were made by the South and the things that occurred, miraculous things for the Union Army, obviously I see the hand of God. When we talked about, we've had earlier sessions about the Revolutionary War, and where George Washington at one time said that the result of that, he is quoted as saying, was almost a miracle. And I would qualify that and say it absolutely was a miracle. The same as Samar Bay, totally outnumbered on the American colonists against the greatest army in the world at the time, the British nation. So we can see the hand of God. And I think it's appropriate to talk about this now because there are conflicts that are going on. We see a lot of casualties, a lot of civilian casualties that occur. Very, very, very heartrending to see that happen. But I also now, throughout my study of history and reading several books, see that for those that have faith, and Joshua really emphasized this, for those that have faith, and in our families, if we have loved ones, men and or women in conflict in the battle zone, it's incumbent upon us, I believe, to pray for them and ask for the Lord's protection, because He will protect them. There is that promise, as Nancy said in her introductory statement, as the sons of Helaman. They did not doubt, they did not fear, because they had been taught by their mothers. And certainly, those mothers prayed for those young men every day. The same as with Nancy prays for her sons and her grandsons. Yes?
There are faithful soldiers that have died.
Yes, that is true. There are faithful soldiers who have died. And that's often a question that has come to my mind. I'm not the one to decide when and how any of that might occur. But I do know that if we're faithful and we pray, and if it's Father's will that they return, they will return. Again, I appreciate everyone that's participated. I'd like to bear my testimony that I know and recognize, and we have seen it many, many times in our family, where my dad was talking the way he was preserved. And most impressive about that, once the conflict was over, where he stated at the end, and Chung Hogi said, "Me God, me God." And my dad said at that time, he realized this Japanese sailor, the day before, the most hated person in the world, the day after, a friend. And those attitudes can help us through these conflicts. And I leave that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.